3 orchids just came out of 3 shipping boxes. One has already dropped a few buds, one still looks almost perfect, and one looks ordinary enough that it would be easy to ignore. If you had to choose right now, which one would worry you most? Before I water, repot, fertilize, trim, or move any of them into my orchid collection, I want to answer that question with evidence, not with the first impression. The day an orchid arrives is one of the easiest moments to make a well-intentioned mistake. A soft leaf can make you reach for the watering can. A loose plant can make you want to repot immediately. A dropped bud can make you assume the whole orchid is failing. And a plant covered in flowers can make you relax before you have checked the parts that matter more. So today, I am using the same 10 checks on all 3 orchids. By the time we reach the roots and the potting media, at least one of these plants may look very different from how it looks right now. The first thing I do is document the orchid before I change anything. I like to start while the box is still being opened, because once the plant is out, the packaging is removed, the moss is disturbed, or the leaves are repositioned. Part of the original story is gone. A quick video of the unboxing gives me a record of how the plant was packed, whether the pot shifted, whether the flower spike was bent, whether buds or flowers were already loose in the box, and whether the potting material looks unusually wet or dry. I also take a few clear photos before I clean anything up. I photograph the whole plant, then I move closer to any leaf damage, broken flower spike, fallen buds, damaged pot, or suspicious area around the crown. If the orchid arrived in a transparent pot, I also photograph the visible roots before watering them because their color and condition can change after moisture is added. I am not doing this because every fallen flower means there is a cellar problem. I am creating a baseline. If I need to compare the orchid tomorrow, in a week, or if I need to contact the seller about obvious shipping damage, I know what the plant looked like before I touched it. This is especially important when emotion takes over. A plant that looked shocking in the first 5 seconds can look much less alarming after you slow down and inspect it. The opposite can happen too. A plant that looks beautiful from across the room can reveal a serious concern once you look closely. So, the first rule is simple. Document first, diagnose second. If I find obvious damage during this first inspection, I also check the seller's arrival policy before I make major changes. Different sellers have different requirements for reporting shipping damage, and some may ask for photos of the box, packing materials, label, pot, and plant. I send clear evidence and describe what I found without exaggerating it. If the plant needs an emergency action to prevent further damage, plant health comes first, but whenever possible I document the condition before I repot or trim. That keeps the care decision and the customer service record separate and clear. I also keep the packaging nearby until the inspection is finished. If something turns out to be damaged or unusually wet, I may want to look again at how the pot was secured, where moisture collected, or whether a flower spike was pressed against the side of the box. Once that record is made, then I can start asking what the orchid may have experienced on the way to my home. The second check is temperature and shipping stress. An orchid inside a box can travel through conditions that are very different from the room where I grow my plants. It may have spent hours in a warm delivery vehicle, passed through a cold loading area, sat near a door, or simply moved through several environments in a short period. That does not mean I can look at the plant and immediately diagnose heat damage or cold damage, but it reminds me not to force another sudden change the moment I open the box. If the plant feels unusually cold or warm, I let it settle in a stable indoor environment with gentle air movement and bright but indirect light. I do not move it straight into hot sun because the leaves look pale. I do not put it under a cold air conditioning vent because the room feels comfortable to me. And I do not use a dramatic temperature change as a way to wake the plant up. The goal on arrival day is stability. Flowers and buds can be more sensitive to environmental changes than the rest of the plant. So if Orchid A has dropped a few buds, that is worth documenting, but it is not enough by itself to tell me the roots are failing or the plant is dying. The flowers can show stress before the crown or root system shows a serious problem. That is why I do not make the watering decision from the flowers. Temperature may explain part of what happened in transit, but it still does not tell me whether the plant itself is in trouble. For that, I start with the leaves, because they are the easiest part for a beginner to see and the easiest part to misread. The third check is the leaves. I look at the overall position of the leaves first. Are they naturally arching outward, or are they hanging in a way that looks suddenly limp? Then I look for damage that could have happened from packing. A crease where a leaf was folded, a split near the edge, a scrape, a bruise, or a tip that was pressed against the box. Mechanical damage can look ugly without being a disease. Then I check firmness. A healthy Phalaenopsis leaf usually has some substance to it. That does not mean every leaf has to stand stiff and upright. Older leaves can arc, and different plants naturally carry their leaves differently. What I am looking for is a leaf that feels noticeably softer, thinner, or less firm than I would expect for that plant. This is where many people make the first watering mistake. A soft leaf can be associated with dehydration, but a soft leaf does not prove the pot is dry. If roots have been damaged, the plant can lose access to water even while the potting media is still wet. If the orchid was stressed in transit, the leaf can also look worse than it will after the plant has had time to settle. So I note the softness, but I do not water yet. I also inspect both sides of every leaf. On the underside, I look for small marks, insects, sticky residue, pale speckling, or anything that looks out of place. At the base of the leaf, I look for damage where the leaf joins the stem. I pay extra attention to areas where packaging may have rubbed against the plant. If a leaf is torn, but the tissue around the tear is dry and stable, that is a different situation from tissue that is becoming soft, dark, translucent, or rapidly expanding. One looks like physical damage that needs to be kept clean and dry. The other deserves closer attention. The important point is not to cut a leaf simply because it looks imperfect. I want a reason before I remove living tissue. At this stage, Orchid A may still look like the weakest plant because of the dropped buds and softer leaves, but the leaves are only the outside of the story. The next place I check matters more to the future of a Phalaenopsis than the temporary appearance of the flowers. The fourth check is the crown. On a Phalaenopsis, the crown is the central growing point where new leaves emerge. I look at it before I water anything, because I want to know whether it is clean, dry, and structurally sound. I gently separate the upper leaves enough to see the center without forcing them apart. I am looking for trapped moisture, damaged tissue, unusual softness, dark areas that appear wet rather than simply pigmented, and any sign that the newest growth has been injured. If there is a little dust or dry debris, that is very different from wet, soft tissue. I do not pour water into the crown to clean it. Keeping water sitting in the crown is exactly what I want to avoid. This is also where a beautiful flower display can become distracting. Orchid B may still have perfect blooms, but flowers are temporary. The crown is part of the plant's ongoing growth. If I have to choose what to inspect carefully, I care more about the condition of the crown than whether every bloom survived shipping. If I see moisture sitting deep in the crown, I remove the excess carefully with something absorbent and let the area dry with gentle air movement. I am not blasting the plant with a fan or putting it in direct sun. I am simply removing standing moisture and giving the plant a stable environment. If the crown looks clean and firm, that is reassuring. But I still do not declare the orchid healthy yet. A plant can have a good crown and still have a pest problem, damaged roots, or media that stays wet for too long. This is the first point where the orchid that looked healthiest on the table can suddenly move down the list, because we are finally checking the structure instead of the flowers. The fifth check is pests. I do this before I put a new orchid near any established plants. I start under the leaves, especially near the base where small insects can hide. Then I inspect the leaf joints, around the flower stem, along the buds and flowers, around the rim of the pot, and on the surface of the potting media. Mealybugs can look like tiny bits of white cotton. Scale can appear as small raised bumps that are easy to overlook if you only glance at the top of the leaf. Other pests may leave webbing, sticky residue, fine spotting, or visible movement. I am not trying to identify every possible pest from one quick look. I am looking for any reason to slow down, isolate the plant, and inspect more carefully. A clean first inspection is good news, But it is not proof that the plant is completely pest-free. Eggs and tiny insects can be difficult to see, and some problems become obvious only after a few days in a stable environment. That is one reason quarantine later in this process matters, even if the orchid looks spotless today. If I do find a suspicious insect, I do not immediately spray every chemical I own onto a stressed plant. I separate the orchid, identify the problem as accurately as I can, and choose a treatment that matches the pest. The same rule applies here as with watering and repotting. Act on evidence, not panic. Even if all 3 orchids pass this inspection, I am still not putting any of them directly into the collection. But before we talk about quarantine, we need to look at the part that can completely change our judgment of these plants. The 6th check is the roots, and this is the part I do not rush. If the orchid is in a clear pot, I inspect every root I can see through the sides first. I do not pull the plant out just because I am curious. If enough of the root system is visible to make a reasonable assessment, and there is no urgent reason to disturb the plant, I can learn a lot without adding another layer of stress. Healthy Phalaenopsis roots can look different depending on moisture. A dry root may appear silver or grey-green. After watering, an active root with intact velamen often becomes greener. That color change is normal. What matters just as much, and often more, is structure. A useful root usually feels firm rather than mushy. It has substance when gently handled. A damaged or dead root may feel hollow, papery, collapsed, or soft. This is why I do not use brown color alone as a reason to cut. Roots can be stained by bark, moss, fertilizer residue, age, or the potting environment. A darker root that is still firm may be functioning. A pale root that collapses when touched may not be. Color gets your attention. Texture often changes the decision. I also look at root tips. A fresh growing root tip can be a very useful sign that the plant is actively growing. But I do not expect every newly shipped orchid to show a bright growing tip on arrival day. The absence of active tips in one inspection does not tell me the plant has failed. I am building a complete picture. Now I compare the 3 plants again. Orchid A had dropped buds and softer leaves, so it looked dramatic at first. But if its visible roots are firm, the crown is clean, and the pot does not appear waterlogged, I may be less worried than I was during the unboxing. Orchid B may have perfect flowers, but if several visible roots are collapsed or the pot is packed with very wet, dense material, its beautiful top growth does not cancel out what I am seeing below. Orchid C may simply be stable and unremarkable, which on arrival day can be exactly what I want. The exact conclusion has to come from the real plants in front of me. I do not create a problem just to make the story more dramatic. If all 3 have healthy-looking roots, then that is the result. If one has obvious root damage, then that becomes the plant I watch more closely. The value of this check is that it replaces guessing with evidence. Sometimes the pot is opaque, the media hides nearly everything, or the plant is so loose that I cannot tell what is happening. That does not automatically mean I must repot immediately, but it tells me I have less information. I look at drainage, how the plant is anchored, how the media feels, whether there is a bad smell, and whether the plant shows other signs that would justify taking a closer look. If I do remove an orchid from the pot because the evidence says I need to inspect a serious root or media problem, I handle the roots gently. I do not strip away healthy velamen, and I do not cut roots merely because they are old-looking or stained. I trim only tissue I can reasonably identify as dead or severely damaged, using clean tools. The goal is not to make the root system look perfect. The goal is to preserve useful roots. This is also the point where a soft-leaved orchid can surprise you. If the roots are mostly firm and the media is dry, then watering may be reasonable after the inspection. But if the leaves are soft while the media is already saturated and the roots look compromised, adding more water may make the situation worse. The leaf did not lie to us. We simply needed more information before interpreting what it meant. And now that we have seen the roots, there is one more thing that can completely reverse the urge to water: the potting media itself. The 7th check is the media. I want to know what the roots are living in, not just what the top inch looks like. Bark, sphagnum moss, and mixed orchid media behave differently. Fresh bark can drain quickly. Packed sphagnum can hold a large amount of moisture. Old bark can break down and hold more water than it did when it was new. I begin by looking through the pot, if I can. Is there condensation deep inside? Does the center look much darker than the surface? Is the moss tightly compressed? Does water appear to be trapped at the bottom of a decorative outer pot? Does the container actually have drainage? Then I feel the media where I can do so without damaging roots. The top can feel dry while the center remains wet. This is why watering on a fixed schedule is especially risky with a newly arrived orchid. I do not know the seller's watering routine, how much water was added before shipping, or how quickly this media dries in my home yet. I also make a mental note of how heavy the pot feels on arrival. Pot weight is not a perfect moisture meter, but once I compare it with the same pot later as the media dries, it becomes another useful clue. The goal is to learn this plant and this pot, rather than force it into a watering schedule I used for a different orchid. I also pay attention to smell. Healthy orchid media should not smell sour or rotten. A stale, swampy, or sour smell can be a warning that the pot has been staying wet and airless. Smell alone still does not give me the whole diagnosis, but combined with soft roots, dense media, and poor drainage, it becomes much more meaningful. Here is the important beginner lesson. A soft leaf and a wet pot can exist at the same time. If the root system is damaged, the orchid can behave as if it is thirsty because it cannot take up water efficiently. Pouring more water into an already wet pot does not solve that problem. On the other hand, if the roots are firm, the media is genuinely dry, and the plant has just come through shipping, I may decide that a normal watering is appropriate. I water thoroughly and let excess water drain away. I do not leave the pot sitting in standing water, and I keep water out of the crown. This is exactly why the plant should decide the watering. Not the shipping box, not the calendar, and not one soft leaf. I want the roots and media to agree with the decision. By now, I have a much better picture of all three orchids. But even if one of them looks completely healthy, I still give every new orchid its own space at first. The 8th check is quarantine. I do not treat quarantine as punishment for the plant or as proof that it is carrying pests. I treat it as observation space. A new orchid has just entered a new environment, and keeping it separate makes it easier to notice changes without risking the rest of the collection. The quarantine area should still provide appropriate light, temperature, and air movement. I do not put the orchid in a dark closet just because I want it isolated. I choose a location where I can inspect it easily and where it is not touching established plants. I also avoid sharing standing water between pots. If I use tools on a suspicious plant, I clean them before using them on another orchid. If I wipe leaves or remove debris, I do not use the same material across the entire collection. During quarantine, I keep checking the underside of leaves, the leaf joints, the flower spike, and the pot. A pest that was impossible to see on arrival day may become easier to spot later. A damaged area on a leaf may stay dry and stable, which is reassuring, or it may change, which tells me I need to investigate further. Quarantine is not about staring at the orchid every hour. It is about making future changes easier to notice. And now we reach the decision that makes many beginners anxious. Should a newly shipped orchid come out of its pot today? The 9th check is whether repotting is actually needed. I do not automatically repot every orchid the moment it arrives, and I do not automatically refuse to repot a stressed plant. I look at the evidence we have already collected. If the roots we can see are mostly firm, the plant is stable in the pot, the media is draining and drying reasonably, there is no obvious pest issue in the pot, and nothing suggests an urgent root problem, I may let the plant settle before changing the setup. That is especially reasonable when the orchid is still flowering and the existing pot is functioning well. I also do not repot just because I prefer bark over moss. Sphagnum moss is not automatically bad, and bark is not automatically safe. What matters is how the media behaves in my growing conditions and whether I can manage watering correctly. A plant in moss may need a different watering rhythm than the same plant in coarse bark. But there are situations where waiting can be the wrong choice. If the media is badly decomposed, sour, packed in a way that stays waterlogged, if the pot has poor drainage, if the plant is unstable because the root system is severely compromised, or if I have strong evidence that dead roots are sitting in a wet, airless environment. Repotting may be part of solving the problem. The decision should be proportional to the evidence. I do not turn every suspicious root into a full rescue operation. I also do not ignore a clearly failing root environment just because the plant still has flowers. If I decide to repot, I prepare a clean pot with good drainage and a media choice that matches the orchid and my conditions. For many Phalaenopsis orchids, an airy orchid bark mix or a carefully managed bark and moss combination can work well. I choose pot size based on the actual root system, not the width of the leaves or the size of the flowers. When the plant comes out, I handle the roots gently and remove old media without tearing healthy roots unnecessarily. I trim only roots that are clearly dead, mushy, hollow, or severely damaged. I keep firm roots even when they are not cosmetically perfect. Then I position the plant so the crown stays above the media and the plant is stable rather than wobbling loosely. If I decide not to repot today, that does not mean I have decided the plant is perfect. It means the evidence does not justify adding more disturbance right now. I keep observing the roots, the moisture pattern, and the plant's stability. Repotting is a response to evidence, not an arrival ritual. That one idea can save a beginner from two opposite mistakes: leaving a plant in a genuinely failing root environment for too long, or tearing apart a stable orchid simply because it came through the mail. And if I choose not to repot today, doing less does not mean ignoring the orchid. It means watching the right things over the next several days. The 10th check is the first 14 days. I use those 2 weeks as an observation window, not as a promise that the orchid will be fully recovered by a certain date. Some plants settle quickly, others take longer. Some flowers continue normally, while others drop after the move. What I care about is the direction of change. I start with the baseline photos from arrival day. Is the leaf that looked soft getting firmer, staying the same, or becoming more limp? Is the crown still clean and dry? Are the visible roots still firm? Does the media dry at a reasonable pace in this new environment? Have any insects appeared? Are damaged areas staying stable or spreading? I also pay attention to the flower spike and buds, but I keep them in perspective. A plant can lose flowers and still maintain a healthy root system and crown. If the orchid redirects energy away from blooms after shipping, that is disappointing. But flowers are not the only measure of plant health. I do not start chasing improvement with fertilizer during this observation period, just because I want a fast response. Fertilizer is not a substitute for healthy roots, appropriate moisture, suitable light, and stable conditions. If the roots are stressed or severely damaged, adding more fertilizer does not repair them. I also resist the urge to move the plant every day. One day by the east window, the next day under a grow light, then into a bathroom for humidity, then back to the kitchen makes it harder to understand what the plant is responding to. I choose a reasonable location and give the orchid enough consistency that I can interpret what I see. The same applies to watering. I do not decide that every orchid needs water every 7 days, just because 7 days have passed. I check the roots and media again. A clear pot makes this easier, but even without one, I can learn how heavy the pot feels when wet and when dry, how quickly the top and center of the media change, and how the plant responds. If I see new deterioration, I respond to the new evidence. A leaf injury that becomes soft and expands deserves more attention. Roots that were firm and later collapse tell me conditions may be wrong. A pest that appears during quarantine changes the plan. But if the plant remains stable, I do not invent a treatment simply because nothing dramatic is happening. Now we can return to the 3 orchids from the beginning. Orchid A may still have fewer flowers, but if the crown is clean, the roots are firm, and the media is behaving well, its ugly first impression may have been mostly shipping stress. Orchid B may still look beautiful, but if its media is staying too wet, or the root system is weaker than expected, it may deserve closer monitoring. Orchid C may turn out to be the least dramatic plant and the easiest one to stabilize. Those are examples of how the evidence can change our first impression. The real verdict must match the real plants. Sometimes, the prettiest orchid is also the healthiest. Sometimes the stressed-looking orchid really does have the biggest problem. The point is that we no longer have to guess from the flowers alone. The healthiest-looking orchid on arrival is not always the healthiest orchid after inspection, and the worst-looking orchid is not always the one that needs the most intervention. That is why these 10 checks work best as a sequence. Each one answers a different question, and together they tell us what the plant actually needs. So when an online orchid arrives, remember the order. Document the unboxing. Notice the temperature and the conditions the plant just came from. Read the leaves without letting one soft leaf dictate the watering. Inspect the crown. Look carefully for pests. Let the roots change the diagnosis. Check the media before adding water. Give the new orchid its own observation space. Decide whether repotting is truly needed. Then watch the trend over the next 14 days. The first day with a new orchid is not about doing the most. It is about learning enough about the plant to avoid doing the wrong thing. Inspect first, stabilize second. Intervene only when the evidence supports it. If this checklist helps you feel more confident the next time an orchid arrives at your door, consider subscribing for more practical orchid care guides. And if you have ordered orchids online before, tell me in the comments what surprised you most when you opened the box. Thanks for watching, and I hope your next orchid arrival starts with fewer guesses and better decisions.